tendremos un área de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, pues será muy placentero para nosotros el poder brindarles información de primera mano y muy sólida. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Kevin, bienvenido. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana.
Thank you, Victoria. I appreciate that. I think I got about 75% of what she was saying. I'm working on my Spanish, but it's just not there yet. And every time I come to Monterrey, I promise Victoria that I'm going to learn more, I'm going to practice more of my Spanish, but I am just not at the point where I'm comfortable actually putting you through a very, very long speech as I try to say it in Spanish. So I appreciate your flexibility in allowing me to deliver this message in my native tongue. Thank you for your time in coming today. I really appreciate it. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is something that I call the value of values. It's something that is near and dear to my heart, something that I feel very passionately about. And so I've developed this talk really to try to emphasize the importance of why we should be considering values in our HR processes and practices. I'm not really sure why it's the case that values don't tend to get as much love as some of the other things. Hard skills, looking at resume builders, education, I understand why those things are important. And I appreciate that people are paying attention to personality and behaviors more in the past 20 years than maybe they did before. But values still don't get as much attention. And I think maybe part of it is because it's touchy-feely, it's inside, it's a little bit harder to see what it is. But hopefully what I'll convince you of through the course of this talk is that values really do have a significant impact on different organizational practices and processes. It was interesting, DDI, familiar with DDI, Development Dimensions International? They're actually a longtime Hogan partner. And they their Australia branch did a survey a couple years ago where they asked about 230 HR professionals who represented about 200 different organizations in Australia. They asked them, how important do you believe assessing values fit, cultural fit is for selection? 90% of them, 90% of the respondents said that it is absolutely critical or very important for us to be assessing cultural fit in our selection practices. Now, what percent of them do you think actually do that? It's much less. Only around a third, about 30% actually, of the same respondents said that they consistently will use or assess cultural fit as part of their selection practices. Okay, hopefully it doesn't restart on me. We'll assess it regularly. Another third said, oh, sometimes, and then the other third said, we never do it, despite the fact that everybody felt that it is absolutely critical to assess cultural fit as part of selection. So I'm trying to understand why it is that it still tends to be the assessment that gets left out of HR practices. I appreciate that people are interested in using more of our behavioral personality assessments, but whenever they are deciding where to cut costs or to cut administration time, unfortunately, values is the first thing that gets cut out. Hopefully what you'll see, though, is from the importance of it, maybe we should consider keeping it in. So first, I want us to understand and get on the same page about what I mean by values. If you do a Google search and you start talking about values with leaders, values with organizations, many times they will use the term values as a proxy for integrity. Does that leader have values? Really what they're saying is he ethical? You know, does she have morals? That's not what I mean by values. Integrity is a value, but I'm not using those terms interchangeably. Integrity is one of the values. Values instead are more about what you're motivated by, what you're interested in, what type of environment you're going to fit better in. You think about motives, needs, drivers, those are all subsumed by what we call values. Now the other thing to know, and this is probably part of the reason why values do not get as much attention in HR practices, is because values do not necessarily equal behavior. There is an imperfect relationship. Just because you find something important does not mean that you necessarily act in a way that fulfills that value. Now, for how many psychologists or psychology students do we have in here? Okay? So maybe you've heard of something called cognitive dissonance theory before, right? And now cognitive dissonance says that we are motivated to create an equilibrium or balance between our beliefs or attitudes and our behavior. So in that way, people still have a motivation. They still have a motivation to be able to behave in a way that is congruent with values. But a lot of the research that I've been doing, and more recently in understanding conflicts, is to see that people don't always have behavior that matches those values. So it's important to have that distinction. Now I promise this is not a commercial, but just because as I go through this presentation, I'm going to be referring to different value dimensions. So just so we have a common framework or library to work from, these are the 10 dimensions that are measured by Hogan Assessment's motives, values, preferences, inventory. It's our values measure. So each one of these represent the collection of research that's been done by Holland, by Allport, by Springer, by Murray. Even you can see some stuff from Maslow in here as well. So you have all these different dimensions, things like power, that's the desire to compete, succeed, and achieve, to ascend in authority. Affiliation, the desire to be around other people. Altruism, the desire to do things to help your fellow man. Tradition, belief that traditional values, moral disambiguity, that those things are important to you. These are dimensions that I'll probably be referring back to as I talk about various stories throughout this talk. Just kind of keep those in mind. Outline, very simple. We've talked about defining what values are. Then what I want to do is I want to go by a level of analysis, explain the value of values at the individual level, at the group level, at the leader level, and at the organizational level, so that we understand at each of these levels what impact values can have on the organization. And then obviously I'll sum it up and say what the takeaway points are. Okay, now first I've got a question. How many of you in here have worked for an organization where you felt like you were not a good fit? You're not a good fit for the organization. Okay. Wow, so more than half. More than half. And that is pretty common whenever I give this talk. It doesn't matter where I am in the world. Many people have experienced that. And I would bet that for some of you, if I had a one-on-one conversation about it, you may not even be able to fully articulate or explain why it is you weren't a fit. You felt it. You felt that you just were not like the rest of them. And obviously you remember that because it has an impact on your psyche. People are motivated to feel like they belong. It goes back to Dr. Hogan's socioanalytic theory of personality. We all have the two primary motives of getting along with others in order to get ahead. And that is better facilitated by being with other people who are like-minded, who believe in the same things or value the same things that we do. Now for the employee, we assess our level of fit at multiple levels. The first of which is person-job fit. So we evaluate the extent to which we believe that we fit with the job that we are occupying. Now you can probably think of somebody, maybe you've been in this position before, where maybe the person had the skills or experience or even the personality to perform a job well, but nothing in that job was of personal motivation for them. It wasn't something that they intrinsically valued or were motivated by. that can have an impact on their perceptions of fit, and as I'll talk a little bit later, on in some important outcomes for them, both individual and organizational outcomes. Next is person-supervisor fit. You could probably think of a situation where you've had, maybe you've experienced this yourself, where you have a high-performing employee and a good boss, but for some reason they just can't get along. Now, it can be based on style, communication style, but I would argue that sometimes, and research bears this out, is that it's about a conflict in values. We don't find the same things to be important, so it's difficult for us to get along in order to get ahead. We also evaluate our level of fit with the group that we're working with, the team that we're a part of. And we know that it's important to not be an outcast. You can call it the intergroup bias or the black sheep effect. We know when we don't fit with everybody else. And you can have somebody who, on their own, would be a pretty good performer. They may even have a great track record, a good resume. You get them into that team and they just never fully assimilate. They never fully integrate with that team. And I would argue that many times it's about a conflict in values. And then lastly, about person-organization fit. We are also motivated to find that we fit or belong with the organization and what they espouse as their own values. What they find to be important, the way they go about business. Does that fit for me? Does that speak to me? We're also motivated to find a level of fit at that level. There are some people, you can take an organization that does the same thing, same product, same service, but they go about doing it in a different way. Right? I'll give you an example. I used to be, and I think that Victoria might have mentioned that, a long time ago, in a past life, I was a recruiter. I used to do headhunting for the legal field. It's great work, right? And it was interesting because I had a little bit, I wasn't the best, but I had a little bit of success. But I did not have the most success until I learned an important lesson. I would see a resume, a client organization, a law firm would say, "Hey Kevin, can you find me somebody who